Sheila Strobel, as the director at Vetri, and we're here in the Mount Baker neighborhood of Seattle with artist Dawn Bassett. We're so excited to be here today.
Thanks so much for coming, Sheila. It's good to have you guys.
So Dawn, we are going to do a walkthrough of your studio today and see some of the paintings that are going to be in your show at Vetri.
Yes, very good. Come on along, come on board.
I would say, while we're looking at your work, that your work is one of an artist who's almost in the mid-arc of your career. Even though this is your first show at Vetri, it takes so long to master this material.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to this point?
Sure. Yeah. So even to this day, I don't do it all the time, but if I'm doing full walls or fireplace installations or carved columns or something, the whole time I'm doing it, I'm always thinking, it's all practice, right? Like every minute I spend with this magic mud is practice. And I love this material. It's called Tadillac. That's usually the plaster I use. Sometimes I use Marmarino and sometimes I use Venetian plaster.
And these are all lime-based plasters. Can you tell us a little bit? One of the things that we're fascinated about is that this material is basically the same mineral composition as glass, and it's just
what is so crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when I met you down at the gallery and you were walking me through and telling me about all these other artists' amazing glass pieces, you were talking about it, and then I had to go home, of course, and like wiki rabbit hole like glass, and I kept coming up across like lime, ash, all these other things, and I'm like, the difference really is that, and which is how we end up with the show name, is that I use water and pressure, and glass artists use fire and air. And I just think that's incredible. It's so transformative.
Kind of like sometimes you can use the same ingredients to make a souffle that puffs up or a pancake.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's the same raw materials.
Totally.
And I think you're also playing with it in a similar way that glass artists do, where sometimes your surfaces are matte and absorbing light, and sometimes they're reflecting light by simply how shiny they are.
I think that's another component of like that they share, is that the particulates in the plaster are marble pieces, so they're a crystalline structure and similar to silicates and everything in glass. So depending upon how you burnish it, how you lay it down, whether you drag your knife at 90 degrees across it, or you really polish it with your whole body weight, you get either reflection off of it, or it's like it absorbs all the light. It's so incredible. And yeah, similar to glass, like etched glass, like, you know, have the glass polished and you get such a different
I can see
interaction.
that on the surfaces here in this piece right here.
Gosh,
Everything that
like,
you just described.
When you stand at this angle and you look across it with the light coming from it, it's like mirror versus velvet, and that's just plaster.
And it's the blackest black I've ever seen. It's so rich. How do you get that deep
plaster
color?
does not want to be black, right? Because it's lime and it's marble, and those are white stones. They're like very like naturally unpigmented. And so I use it dry, and then I mix it with pigments that are mineral pigment, water-based mineral pigments that are like from, you know, quarries out of Provence or outside of a volcano in Japan. Like you just...
That's very romantic.
Isn't it? It's so... If there is one like great romance in my life, I think plaster has to be it. Like, it's
well, that's
just
how
so
I see you. I've
romantic.
known you for many years, Dawn, and I've come to know you as somebody that can do literally almost anything.
That's so
I know
kind.
you're an excellent cook and menu designer. I know that you're a master shade maker, like some of the examples here in your shop, and that's kind of what you did when I met you.
Yeah.
And yet I feel like when you started to work with plaster, and particularly Tadillac, you really are an artist who really found your favorite medium.
Oh my gosh, I feel like it found me at the right time too, because it was just, I'd been working with plaster for so long, but this plaster in particular, Tadillac, which is like 2,000 years, it's the oldest plaster that people have been using, and actually I should say man has used, because it's always been in the hands of men. And they use it for building. They use it for showers, sinks, walls in Morocco. Like, this is a building material, like Americans use concrete, but it is so beautiful. And they also know it's beautiful, and they live in that beauty. Like, can you imagine living in a whole room of this? Like, I did my bedroom that way because the way the morning light shines on it, it's like pinkish golden, and then in the evening it just changes
because
all
it's
the
all
time.
particles, and each
Yes.
particle is reflecting
Yeah.
light differently. Another tie-in to glass is how it does refract the light
And changes during
Yeah.
the day.
and
Yeah.
changes. Yeah.
Also, how it relates, I think, to other objects. Glass is the same, where, you know, you can look at a stained glass window or a glass object, and on its own, it can be so beautiful. And you see it in context of another material like wood or porcelain or plaster, and plaster is the same. Like, you see it in context of other materials, and it just makes it more beautiful.
And I can't wait to see these pieces in the context of the glass pieces that we have at
I
Vetri.
think they're gonna be best.
I think it's a very
They're
nice
gonna relate really well.
combination. Yeah. Dawn, one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit is that it's similar to glass, the artists and the artisans who have used this were never women. I mean, if we really think about it, on the island of Murano, none of those apprentices
Exactly.
were little girls.
Yeah.
And the same with plaster. None of these people in Morocco historically that have been using this plaster were women. And now here we are standing in your studio, and you're literally the only person I know, and I am looking and I am Googling people that are using this particular material for fine art. And so I really think you're groundbreaking in your use of this particular material.
Thank you, Sheila. I know of a couple people who, after I introduced, like, they were also plaster, like, artisans. They did plaster work as a building material, and I know that, like, after meeting them, they started to articulate it into their art as well. They're men. All plasters are men, almost. You know,
Almost,
it's like
yeah.
all the time. If I find another plasterer, they're a man, and they use it in the strictest, they use their material in the strictest way, the way they were taught, the way that that person was taught. And I don't feel like it wants that. Like, we talked before that tadalak comes from an Arabic word meaning to massage. And I'm like, that is the most female, like, to me, I'm like, get your hands on someone and be like, this, like, tactile, beautiful, moving experience is female. And so I think tadalak, I think plaster is always meant to be in the hands of women.
And now it is.
Yeah.
It really is. And another thing that I think is interesting about the way that you're working is that, similar to oil paint, you're doing very thin layers, like the way that an oil
So
painter uses
thin.
washes.
Yeah.
So thin.
Really, really thin.
But you
can
build up.
see, like, this is one layer, and it makes such a difference, but that's such a thin line, you know?
And so I know it takes 4 layers to do a tadalak finish, and you're doing more on top of that for your
sometimes
relief?
16, 20. Yeah, it really depends on what end result I want, you know? So, like, this piece over here, that is just the material untinted. So that had like a base coat that had 2 more coats, and then on the 3rd coat, and I have to time it so all the drying and everything is happening. That's when I'm getting the texture. But this is only 4 layers, and I think there's pieces down at Vetri already that are 20. And it's just because what you can get out of those layers. And
The piece called Bodies with the big long layer. With
that's the one.
That's
Yeah.
a beautiful piece.
Yeah, it really looks like a sculpted piece of marble or limestone or something. Like, it was chiseled out, but really it's applied. Which is something that I also think, I mean, maybe it's crazy to say, but I think a woman would come up with, because if you're taught that this is how you do it all the time, then you're only thinking in that way. Whereas there's a way to use plaster that is called sgraffito, where you carve into it. And when I was developing this string pulling technique, which is used in Fist Through the Wall, and then this In the Night I Reach for You piece, I thought, what if instead of carving into it, you were revealing it by pulling something out of it? One, it's a cathartic feeling, but 2, you'll get a totally different result.
It's like you're doing additive sculpture as well as subtractive.
Yeah.
And the pulling the string is carving. Why don't you show us some of what you're talking about with the string?
Sure. So this, I use string to get these lines.
So you apply the plaster in the many layers, and then you
So
pull.
I adhere the string onto my substrate, which these are birch cradles. And I lay it all down very finely with like little pin nails. I get it all perfect how I want. let that dry, and then do layers and layers and layers and layers to cover it up. This has many layers covering up the strings. There's something happening in this place
There's a
that
composition?
only I know about. Yeah. And whoever ends up living with this piece, they can decide they either want to live with mystery or they can reveal it.
You're kidding.
No, that's what I love, because
That's a
we need more
very,
mystery in our lives.
a very original novel approach. That's a beautiful, it's so beautiful just the way it is with these strings.
Which I think is magic, right? Like, because you get movement with strings and you never get movement with plaster because it's such a static material like marble. That's why there's that. There's one piece down at Vetri now that has rope, and I started playing with this milliner's rope that I found that came from the same supplier that does all the rope for Hermes. So it's just beautifully made, and it's hard to find materials like that these days, you know, so you source and I found them outside of the UK. And I'm working on a piece over here that will use more rope, because I just love this idea of like movement and softness with this thing that when you look at it, it looks like marble or a piece of stone.
Yeah.
And that to me is also why I use thicker substrates to work on, you know, thicker birch cradles. Sometimes they're 1.25 inches, sometimes they're up to 3 inches deep, because when it's hanging on the wall, you're just like, oh my gosh, that weighs a ton. But because it's plaster, it's so light.
And I think it feels, it makes you feel a certain way.
Yeah.
My son, when he was training as a
heaviness.
sign painter, he said that he compared vinyl lettering to hand lettering, and he just said it just makes you feel different. And I just
it's
think
the
that
perfect way to put it.
that relationship to materiality is just so beautiful with this material in particular.
Absolutely.
It's just a beautiful material.
Yeah,
and
so
is this also the string?
I pulled string through, so I laid all this out, and then I don't pull my own work anymore. I only let people who purchase a piece or guests pull pieces. And this was pulled by a woman named Jane who had lost her husband. She's 80 years old, and they'd been together a really long time. It's the love of her life. And this piece I made for me is called In the Night I Reach for You. And it was just polished
You're gonna
black.
make me cry. That's
And
beautiful.
she didn't know what was behind it, you know, and she came in, and I have video of that, and she pulled it, and I have like goosebumps talking about it, because she knows that feeling so well of like, you wake up in the night still wondering if that person's next to you.
This is really,
And
really drawing you
I
in.
was hoping that it would give that feeling, and it was really wonderful to know that it did that for her as well.
It's a very powerful piece.
This piece too is string that was underlaid. So there, I did like a indigo mixed in with my plaster to get this color, and then I did layers and layers of plaster over the top, and I laid out on the string, and so it was one piece that as I pulled it, it made this shape. And this is one of the only pieces I've pulled, and it's called Fist Through a Wall. And
We've all felt that way
we've all
sometimes.
felt that way, you know, where you're just like, ugh. But for me, it was really cathartic, because I definitely have rage inside me, but because I know what it takes to make a wall smooth, I never put my fist through a wall, because I'm like, oh, it will be horrible to fix that. But I really was feeling this really trapped and like intense feeling where I could have put my fist through a wall. And so I did it this way, where I pulled it out of it instead.
Art
and it
saves
gave me,
us. Art
it
saves us
totally
every
does.
time.
It totally does. And it gave me the same feeling. It was so cathartic. After I pulled this one, I walked across the street home and took a bath and just like went to bed so early because I was so
I
tired.
think what you're saying is you've entrapped emotion. You've literally entrapped an emotion into a solid state, which emotion, like glass, like plaster, it's a liquid. It
ephemeral.
doesn't turn
Yeah.
into a solid until we manipulate it with pressure or heat.
Yes.
And what you've done is you're taking an emotion and putting it into a solid state. It's a fascinating piece.
Well, and emotions are really based on stories, you know, like there are these moments that happen for us, like these little story snippets in our lives, and story is huge for me. Like I write all the time, and I love that what you said, like you can freeze in a moment something that happened like this forever.
Exactly.
Like this will live forever. And also that's the amazing part too, is you could put this in the sunniest room. It won't change because plaster is not like paint. It will never fade.
It's archival to the same degree as glass. It will last literally forever. It's been around since Egyptian times. We still have examples of glass, and the same with plaster. In Rome, the first aqueducts were this plaster. When we're talking about the solidifying the state of emotion, it makes me think of another way I've thought of you is that you're a little bit like a long distance sail racer, where these people work for over a schedule that goes throughout, you know, sometimes more than a year, and it's kind of building up and training towards this goal, where they know where they're going,
right?
And they aren't going anywhere else. And I think similar to glass, you need to know what you're doing in the studio to a certain extent, because you can't just do a wash and then do something over. You really kind of have to really plan these pieces.
Yeah.
Very intentional.
That's so true. You have to be absolutely intentional with all the layers, knowing that this is going to interlock with this, and you have to burnish it at this time, and you have to do this at this time. And I always say I don't do anything important because this is not like heart surgery, but I do something that is ultra specific and takes so much concentration and consideration, and I think that to me is such a liberating thing, because then I can get out of my head and my heart for a second and get in my hands and make something. And then when I step back and look, I'm like, oh, there it is. But I got to be kind of free from that emotion the whole time I was working on it. Like I was putting it into it instead of thinking about it or feeling it. I was just working.
It's like a record of practice. I think when I think about all the layers in the pieces, and one of the first things about plaster I learned is that every single layer is going to telegraph through. It's just like oil paint that way, even though it seems like it's a solid form that where you almost have like a top layer that is the layer. It's every layer underneath that is the layer.
And that's such a good point. You can definitely see that with this piece by the window, which has Venetian telegraphs the most, right? Because it's the thinnest. So when you look dead on at this, you see all this movement like moth wings. It's what I used on my back wall as well as Marmarino and Venetian. And when you see all that, you realize that, what you said, well, what your hand does, you're going to see. And so you have to be really specific and
have a good trowel signature.
Exactly.
You know, another thing that I'm interested in is these two pieces over here, because we talk about three-dimensionality. Artists are always trying to create that, whether they're working with a three-dimensional form or painting. And obviously these pieces on this side of the room are very three-dimensional.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a fully baked idea for me, because it's really coming out of this thing I saw so clearly in my mind. So the tops are really burnished, polished Venetian. Underneath, it's pulled Tadillac, and it's ultra pigmented. So the light shines off the front, and it absorbs into the bottoms. And
I can see that.
The piece is called Crushed, and I wanted each layer to not be even. You know, I mean, it's not the same zigzag when you look at it in profile. And the profile to me is just as important as the face.
And I love the shadow. Glass collectors are very familiar with shadows.
I love that too. Well, having done lighting for almost 20 years, like I think about shadow all the time, you know, and how light is diffused through materials, and I love shadow as well. And then these pieces, I was working on this idea of like a curio cabinet, and like to articulate different moments in time inside of this same space. And a lot of the same, you'll see symbols come up in my work, and they've been with me my whole life, where in a moment where something happens, sometimes I'll see this flash of that symbol and kind of like smell. I'm just a very visual person, but you know how like smell or a song, you hear a song, reminds you of a time in your life? For some reason, there are these like time signatures, and like this symbol, or there's this like in dial tones, this like chord of the telephone you keep seeing again and again. But most of my work relates to love or my childhood, these huge emotional moments of my life, because my childhood was the best. Like I'm not good at being an adult, but I'm great at being a kid. Like all the skills of being a kid.
You got that.
I nailed them. Playing with mud, playing with string, I got it.
You got that.
Yeah, I got that.
Well, you're good at being an adult too, and you're really good at being an artist. I think that every single thing that I've known you to excel at, which is, definitely lighting is a really huge part of what you've been doing. I think all of these things are involved in this particular body of work, and we're so excited to have you at Vetri. It's an honor. It's just very exciting to have you at Vetri, and I can't wait for your opening.
Oh my gosh, I'm so thrilled and delighted. I mean, it means so much, but also it'll be really fun to see the work, not surrounded by buckets and chaos in the studio.
And
so
lit
I'm
well
so happy
and with
about
glass
that.
objects.
Yes, lit well and in relation to their new best friends, which is glass. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at the opening on First Thursday.